My name is Mark Ainsworth, and I am Head of Data Insights in Schroders. So I lead the team of data scientists that support investment decisions in Schroders, but also are responsible for data scientists in various other teams across the entire business.
Great. So we're here with Mark Ainsworth from Schroders, Head of Data Insights. And one of the things that we've talked about, had an ongoing conversation about with you, Mark, is just your experience with working with external data and at Schroders and how all of those two things intertwine. Could you just tell us a little bit about your past experiences with external data and then maybe what's changed about that over the last couple of years?
Sure. And I mean, my career is quite strange, really. I've been somebody who helps people make decisions with data my entire career, but I've done that in lots of different places. I started at British Airways. I was in Tesco, the grocery chain, where, among other things, I was responsible for the mathematical models that were used to make predictions about how much money a store would make if you built it. And so at that time, you're making heavy use of revenue data, loyalty card data, internal data, but also a huge source of insight was using census data and map data. So that's why I've got this love of maps here. This is the wall. This wall shows the map of London and the whole of the sort of southeast of England, but from as it was 100 years ago. So, and what I love about maps actually is that they are an amazing fusion of a lot of information all layered on top of it. So, different layers all layered together. And often that's where the insights come, is combining different sorts of information, internal and external. So Tesco was a great place to do that sort of thing. I co-ran a business that did survey software. So our customers would be the HR departments of various businesses, so software as a service. And that hooked into another huge source of insight from the outside world, which is about surveys. So that particular business was about asking people to give feedback about each other as colleagues in businesses. But actually, my degree was in psychology. And so psychometrics is a rich source of information. Obviously, market research is all about information about the outside world, what consumers think about a business by asking questions. But the design of those questionnaires is really important because you've got this information in the heads of people and you're turning it into data that you can analyze. And doing that well, doing it consistently, doing it in a way that answers important questions is a huge opportunity. And of course, these days, that sort of survey data can be part of the alternative data field for investment managers. And then the thing I did before I joined Schroders was I was head of analytics in Smart Steps, which was the big data business in Telefonica. So Telefonica run the O2 mobile phone network in the UK. And that was all about taking the exhaust fumes from running a phone network and turning that into insights about crowds. And that was a really interesting experience. Creating something completely new. You had this data, you knew that there's some latent value in it from some decisions people are making somewhere, but how do you work out what the value is? And all the missteps and the mistakes we made in trying to work that out was a fascinating experience. And so then I joined Schroders 8 years ago to set up data science capability. So initially the team was me, and essentially we found opportunities to add value to investment decision makers with using data that's too big or too messy to analyze with Excel. Obviously, that's what all the investment professionals know how to use, and just worked out lots of different areas where we could add a lot of value with that sort of data. A lot of it geospatial, actually. That's a really rich seam we found. I guess the other interesting thing was back in the beginning of that time, we could add a lot of value just by getting data into the building in a database that you could do something with. Whereas these days, the whole investment industry has matured a great deal. All the investment banks have got whole data science teams that do this sort of thing. So the frontier of where we can add value is constantly shifting. And that's a big part of what makes it interesting.
That's fantastic. I want to ask a couple of questions about something in there about integrating survey data and maybe some of this more qualitative information with your internal data and how you might integrate something like that. Could you give a couple of examples of how you're able to take something as abstract as a random sentence typed out by someone in a survey and apply it to a data set that you're looking to make strategic, insightful decisions based upon?
Yeah, there's two examples that spring to mind. One of the key ones we've had in our sort of toolbox for quite some time is insights about brands. So very early on, when I was trying to identify where are those sort of insight blind spots that the investment professionals have, and often people would ask us, "Can you give me some information about this brand here? Like, what do Chinese consumers think about the Burberry brand, and what are the trends there?" And we were able to start getting traction by using Google Trends. And it's a very simple, easy thing to do. Anyone can do that. But what that did was let us sort of get that little flywheel spinning of what are the questions people want to answer. And it became clear that a lot of people had a lot of those sorts of questions. One of the places I worked in, Tesco, was in the customer insight unit there, and they had surveys, designing and commissioning of surveys and analysing of those surveys was a huge part of that. So I learned a lot about how you do surveys well. And of course, a company like Tesco pay money to market research firms to get information about what do people think about Tesco, captured in all sorts of ways. And the companies that sell that data to Tesco and all the other brands of the world, you can also buy it as an asset manager. And it's been super useful. And there's thousands of companies that have brands that can have some insights from that data, but it's not simple because it's survey data. There are some complications about what it really is. Is it spending? Is it opinion? How does opinion map to spending, which is the thing that drives revenues, which drives the share price? That's a real complication to handle, and it's noisy. It's every day if you ask 100 people a question, each day you'll get a different answer, but not because the underlying trend has changed. It's just because that's the nature of sampled data. So devising some strategies and some algorithms to kind of get the signal from the noise has been a key thing we've had to do. And then the other example that springs to mind actually was sort of staff data. So one of the things, as most companies do, Schroders does a regular staff survey where people are asked their opinion about the culture, their team, their manager, and that's summarized and presented back to managers in all sorts of useful ways. And we were asked if we could really get some extra insight from that data. And one of the things we did was natural language processing on all the comments. So across the whole company, there was a couple of questions that was along the lines of, what recommendations would you give to managers to improve how Schroders works? And collectively, the employees of Schroders wrote about 70,000 words of feedback. I mean, that's a novel's worth of stuff to read. And the CEO and the executive committee do not have time to read that. And they're precisely the people that need to read it. So we use some really interesting combinations of natural language processing techniques, but also sort of curated crowdsourcing techniques to chop that text up into distinct chunks and then categorize those chunks. So we could actually say 80 different people made a comment about the kind of grading process for staff progression, even though every single one of those expressed it in a different way. And by bringing some sort of order to that data, we could really draw out some trends and communicate that back internally to fundamentally drive how the company is managed. And that was a super interesting example of absolutely what's in the heads of our employees and turning it into something actionable.
That's amazing advice, Mark. I love how you dug into really just moving things from qualitative to an actionable piece of information. Moving into another area, I'm curious about the tool set. Every good strategist and practitioner has various tool sets, various arrows in their quiver. And what does your sort of tech stack look like today for database tools?
So, I think the core components are, there's a data store, there's the ways you do stuff with it, the environment you operate in to do that, and then how you kind of get the results out to people. And to be honest, it's very varied. There's a lot of different pieces to that. Certainly in our team, the core ways we do the analysis is either R or Python. And it's quite an interesting debate. I'd say most people use Python, but it's very clear when the heart of what you're doing is about statistics, that's sort of fitting a Bayesian model, or that kind of thing. R is just a much more natural fit to that. If the core thing is about writing code that goes into production, Python's a much better fit. But if the heart of what you're doing is stats, R is a better fit. And there's a little bit of there's always a little bit of a debate about that. Having all the capabilities of the cloud and just core database technologies is a key thing. So we used to depend very heavily on our Hadoop cluster, and that was partly because a key thing we were trying to do is combine external data and internal data. We've got all this information, let's say, about brands, but we also got the information about the portfolios and the holdings of those portfolios. Once upon a time, there's no way we could have such sensitive internal data on the cloud until the whole company had made the journey to the cloud being a first-class part of the kind of technology estate. But now that it is, that's allowing a lot of shift. And so things like AWS SageMaker is becoming an increasingly important part of that sort of tooling. And then in terms of presentation, quite often we use sort of build little lightweight web apps, whether that's Shiny or in Dash, those that we quite often use. And they've got quite a great internal sort of app deployment platform that's been built that uses Kubernetes under the hood, but we call that Foundry. And that's been really great for getting sort of separating the concern of writing the code for your application and getting it out to people, and looking after the server and all that kind of that stuff, which is really important, but it's allows a sort of separation of concerns between the people who know the business problem and writing the code for solving the business problem, which is data scientists in the business, and people who know the kind of important technical problems of keeping everything secure and safe and everything, which is in the server. So that's been helpful. But actually, Tableau is a big piece of what we use as well. It works very well. We've used Tableau Server. And I think I have to say another really important part is if the heart of what you're trying to do is telling a story about the insights from data, that's often like a key final mile. And in certain situations, like if you're doing a webinar, you're hosting a sort of presentation, and PowerPoint is the right medium for that, or slides is the right medium for that. And I have to say, in a weird way, the clunkiness of having to take screenshots of things out of your IDE or out of Tableau or even Excel and copy and paste it into PowerPoint and then put some other picture and put some text that tells the story, the separation between the analytical world and the storytelling world, it can actually be super helpful, because it really forces you to focus on, okay, what's the best way of just telling this story and substantiating that story with the evidence from the data. And that's actually a completely different medium that you've got to literally hand move it across, lets you really focus on that storytelling part of it. So that's weirdly enough, the fact that it's totally not integrated actually works. It lets you put yourself in a different mindset of telling the story, delivering the insight.
I think that last bit is so interesting, and something that I've really found really valuable is just taking the time to, how can I boil this down to just a few words? One of the things that I've done a lot of studying on is the Edward Tufte, and some of the way he uses visual explanations and things along those lines. What are a couple of tips you might give someone who's new to presenting data science output to a more business-oriented audience? But if you had to tell them one or two things to make sure and do, what would you tell that person?
So one thing I would say is to make a very clear distinction between the analysis and the charts that are about working out what's true, exploring the data. That's sort of for you and maybe for your manager who's supervising you. And then what are the charts for communicating the insights? And that is completely different. And indeed, there may be two separate reports. There's the report for your manager and for your colleagues that explained what you did and how you did it. And but again, completely separate. There's what was the insight? What is it that you, the audience, don't already know that's relevant to you, that is useful to you? What's the bare minimum to show that what you're saying is real? Because there's a real, there's a cognitive sort of capacity for the audience to understand what you're saying, and an investment in sort of working it out, which is just completely different to you as the researcher. So having two reports rather than one is, in a sense, the heart of that. And the other tip I would give, actually, particularly to get a sense of that second part, the storytelling part, is to really pay attention to how good newspapers do this. And there's some of the journalists who do this. So New York Times, The Economist, the FT, they've got some really great, thoughtful data storytellers, data journalists, and they're often very generous on Twitter, showing them the charts that didn't, were on the cutting room floor, the thinking behind how they did it, and really pay attention to how they do that. I think that's super interesting. I once attended an event run by the FT where they highlighted the research that shows the main thing people remember from a chart is the title. And if your title says annual sales 3 years history, then they're not going to remember anything. And of course, you do need to show the chart. It needs to substantiate. It needs to visually show it. But if your title says trends have, sales growth has increased significantly, and you can see in the chart that that's what you see, then that's what people remember. So newspapers are a very useful reference, not just for the data storytellers, but just how newspaper articles work. There's a headline which tells you the story in a sentence. And then the first paragraph tells you the story in a bit more depth. And then the article tells the story again in more depth. And that kind of layering of you're telling the same story over and over at different levels of depth is a very effective technique, because some of your audience are interested and care and some don't. And if you only tell the full story, the people that might be interested, but if it's not obvious to them, will skip it. So a lot of the disciplines of journalists are incredibly useful.
Mark, you've been very generous with your time today. How can we find you online? What's the best place to connect with you?
So I'm on Twitter. I put the odd thing on there. My handle is Ainsworth. Anyone who remembers Wayne's World from the 90s will enjoy that reference, but there's vanishingly few of those these days. And we do sometimes publish white papers on the Schroders website as well.
That's fantastic. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.